Well, a key NATO summit on the war in Ukraine is now heading to a close in Lithuania's capital, with the final key meetings and statements underway. Earlier, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau met Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy, promising ongoing support and inviting him to Canada. And we've also learned from Defense Minister Anita Anand that Canada is part of a coalition of countries that will help train Ukrainian pilots on flying and maintaining F-16 fighter jets. 11 nations are involved in the program that begins in Denmark next month. Also today, Canada signed on to a historic declaration by G7 countries that the EU promising security guarantees for Ukraine. Well, staying on this story is Mitchel Wallerstein. He is a policymaker in Bill Clinton's administration, and was serving as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Counter-Proliferation. He is now a non-resident senior fellow at the U.S. Foreign Policy at Chicago's Council on Global Affairs. Mitchell, thank you so much for taking the time. The joint declaration here of support for Ukraine between the leaders of the G7 has been released, reaffirming, quote, that security in Ukraine is integral to the security of the Euro-Atlantic. Just how significant is this, and what do you think this will mean specifically for Ukraine?
Good morning, Madam. Yes, I think this is a significant statement. I think it's a strong statement. It's not everything that President Zelenskyy and the Ukrainian government wished it would be, since there's no invitation to membership in NATO at the moment. But I think in terms of the signal that it sends to Vladimir Putin, that the NATO allies are committed to supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes, and also that they expect to have Russia held accountable for its actions in Ukraine, is very important.
We know at the news conference, we sort of saw today a toning down of the rhetoric from Zelenskyy. He thanked NATO, toning down of the criticism, I should say, that he had for the NATO leaders. He thanked them, in fact. He said that Ukraine has gained, quote, a significant security victory. How do you think this will be interpreted by the Kremlin?
Yes, President Zelenskyy, perhaps understandably, had made a somewhat petulant statement yesterday, in which he was unhappy about the fact that President Biden and others had signaled there would not be an invitation to membership. But his statement today is much more diplomatic. Again, there's a lot in the joint declaration which he should welcome. Certainly the amount of security assistance that the NATO allies are providing. I just heard a note on your air that about the 11 countries that will be training Ukraine pilots on flying the F-16, lots of other important assistance, including from the French, who are going to supply more longer-range missiles, similar to the ones that the British have supplied. So there's a lot of good news here, and Zelenskyy was recognizing that.
You know, we've heard so much about this package because the NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg did outline this three-part multi-year package that will bring, quote, Ukraine closer to NATO. That's what they said. And it will include new multi-year assistance programs to facilitate the transition of Ukrainian armed Soviet forces from sort of the Soviet era to up to NATO standards. It's going to help, promising to help rebuild Ukraine's security and defense sector. What do you make of that commitment?
Yes, again, I think that's very significant. I mean, we have to remember that Ukraine, when this conflict began, Ukraine was using almost entirely Soviet-era systems, which were tremendously ineffective as compared to Western military equipment. And slowly but surely, the Western allies, particularly the G7 countries, have armed Ukraine with modern Western equipment so that they will now be one of the most effective fighting forces on the European continent. So when this conflict finally ends, and certainly at some point it must come to an end, Ukraine should be able to integrate relatively quickly into the NATO integrated military structure.
I want to ask you a little bit more. You talked about President Zelensky being perhaps a little bit petulant was the word you used. We know Ben Wallace, the UK Defense Secretary, suggested that Ukraine needed to be, more thankful, perhaps a little bit more grateful. He said, quote, whether we like it or not, people want to see a bit of gratitude here. That was his quote. Do you think he has a point?
Well, I think this has been going on now for the better part of 2 years. There's some frustration, a little bit of weariness, perhaps, on the part of the NATO allies. I think President Zelensky has expressed his gratitude on multiple occasions to the leaders of the G7 in particular. But, you can never say thank you often enough. And particularly given the volume of aid, military aid that's being provided, millions and millions of dollars and euros and British pounds, et cetera, there is a sense that the providers of the aid would like to see a continuing recognition by the Ukrainians of the fact that basically the West is saving Ukraine, because without our assistance, Russia would have already won the day.
When Russia launched their full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Putin expected that his forces would take over Kyiv within less than a week. Many analysts thought similarly. Putin has been quite vocal about his disdain for NATO, but this war, rather than sort of dividing and weakening the alliance, has really appeared to strengthen and broaden NATO. Can the alliance, do you think, sustain this kind of unity?
Well, that's, of course, the big question. And Putin continues to bank on the idea that eventually the allies will weary of this campaign, and that if he can sustain it long enough, that eventually Ukraine will be able, will be left in a position where Russia could prevail. I think this NATO declaration is trying to signal in the strongest possible terms that NATO's in it for the long haul. They understand the threat that Russia poses, at least as long as Vladimir Putin is the president of the country. That other NATO allies on the eastern flank, Poland, the Baltic states, et cetera, could be in his crosshairs. So if the stakes are simply too high, we cannot allow Ukraine to fail, and that's what this declaration is signaling.